In 2004, Ms. Miriam Edwards learned with shock and dismay that her sister had been diagnosed with advanced HIV infection, perceived at that time to be a virtual death sentence. Suddenly and without warning, Miriam's world was thrown into chaos. Gripped by shame and fear, fueled by a lack of information about the disease, her initial response was to avoid even a touch or embrace from her sister. Without access to appropriate treatment and care, Miriam watched from a distance as her sister's life ebbed away. Then, one day, the sight of her own flesh and blood, dying without love and affection and devoid of human dignity, jolted her into action. Miriam ignored the stigma and discrimination and social ostracism of the day in her native Guyana and assumed the full-time care of her sister. In a solemn pledge, Miriam gave solace to her sister in her final earthly moments by pledging to a lifetime of service in the field of HIV and AIDS. She had lost a sister, but gained a lifelong vocation. That was the beginning of the work of Miss Miriam Edwards as a persistent and uncompromising advocate, peer educator, and caregiver to those most vulnerable to HIV. Recognizing the true value of networking, she has worked in close collaboration with PANCAP, UNAIDS, UNFPA, Guyana HIV and AIDS Reduction and Prevention Programs, and the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition, reaching the most at-risk population groups. Miriam's work has centered on building capacity among leaders of vulnerable groups within civil society organizations and providing basic skills for effective counseling, providing training in behavior change concepts, and peer education for commercial sex workers. But Miriam's most telling contribution has been her involvement with sex workers in Guyana and across the Caribbean. She is the founder and president of the Guyana Sex Workers Coalition, president of the Caribbean Sex Workers Coalition, and the executive director of the One Love organization, a non-governmental organization that promotes the welfare of persons living with HIV in Guyana. Since 2006, Ms. Miriam Edwards has been a resounding voice and face for sex workers in the Caribbean as she works relentlessly to promote the human rights of sex workers. Miriam has had many powerful and passionate stories to tell. Her interface and support given to persons living with HIV in Georgetown, Linden, and New Amsterdam, her counseling services in promoting acceptance of HIV persons within families across social groups, preserving the human rights and health of sex workers, advocating for and on behalf of vulnerable groups among policymakers and practitioners, and taking her passion beyond the borders of Guyana and into the regional and international community. Ms. Miriam Edwards continues to keep the promise she made to her dying sister, and her greatest legacy is her work in the interest of sex workers across the Caribbean. And it is for this reason that she has been selected by the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition as the proud recipient of the Juanita Altenberg Award 2010.